Hello and welcome to this live stream. Please do jump in the comments if you have anything to talk about with Newcastle United related. My first go, so do give me a little bit of leeway on that. But we are here to talk about Newcastle United in terms of transfers. We're here to talk about Newcastle United in terms of their friendly match with Urawa Diamonds earlier on today in Tokyo. It was a really, really good performance, I thought, overall. The thing to mention, first of all, is that Alexander Isak looks really, really sharp. I think, to me, this is a guy who is going to be one of the best players for Newcastle this season, one of the most important players for Newcastle this season. If he stays fit, I think he can score 25, 30 goals this season. But I think Newcastle are in a position where it's a little bit nervy about transfers. So do get in the comments if you have any questions regarding that. But I thought Newcastle started obviously really well today with Isak up front. Jacob Murphy's form has been fantastic, hasn't it? Let's just talk about that for a second. I mean, is it 3 goals and an assist in the first 2 games? I was at Hull for the opening game of preseason. Opening game of preseason. Hi, Johnny. Hope you're well. The opening game of preseason against Hull, I was there, and it was a really sort of, as you would imagine, performance. I did a video on that with Chris Waters, and it was really a bit strange that game because Newcastle's preseason is in a position where they're sort of a lot further on than we think they are, because we haven't seen, obviously it's 2 weeks later for their first game than in preseason in public than it was last year when they played Gateshead on the 15th of July. They played Hull on the 27th. So there's lots of variables about where Newcastle are. I think Eddie Howe's gone to Japan. I am rambling a little bit because I'm still getting used to this, so apologies for that. Going to Japan was more about demanding the fitness, in terms of the fitness, in terms of match sharpness. I think we've seen that with Joe Willock in the game today, that he didn't play against Hull, and there was a little bit of a concern about Newcastle in terms of that, and in terms of where his fitness was going to be. And he was asked, Eddie Howe, after that game, where was Willock, and Willock had been held back, and then he came in today, and I thought he was phenomenal for the first half. It was Joe Willock at his best. That driving run for the second goal for Murphy's goal was brilliant. And yeah, it's really exciting to see him fit and to see him playing back again. And I think if Newcastle are to start the season really well, it looks like they're going to have to do that without signings. That's where I think that the concern for me is that I think I said this, alluded to this in a video, in the video after the game. I think that Eddie Howe and Chris did as well. Eddie Howe is sort of keeping his powder dry for now. I think he's quite frustrated with the idea that there's no transfers bubbling away. I think we might see another outburst if there's nothing in by the Salah Cup. I was on the True Faith instant reaction earlier, and I kind of said that I think that there's a moment where he's holding back at the moment to see where things go. Apologies, by the way, if you can hear a sort of blaring noise. My MacBook is really old, so if you can hear that in my videos as well, I can't really deal with it. I've got headphones on, so it doesn't distract me, but if it's apologies if you can hear it. But for me, yeah, I think we're in a position where Eddie Howe's talking about being, collective collaboration and being collective and being part of that team, and he's not thinking of the England job. But I also think that if there's no transfers imminent, or there are a couple of rumours that we'll talk about a little bit later, if nothing's imminent, then I think that Eddie Howe might change his tune a little bit, and we might see another calculated outburst. Is a strong word, but very Eddie Howe outburst, if you like, that came in Germany. I think it's very likely that sort of thing could happen again. But we are in a position where Newcastle generally, I think Isak coming back and not having the Euros, as Chris pointed out in that video, really makes a difference. We know that it takes players, even if they've been at Newcastle for a long time to get up to speed with what Eddie Howe wants at the start of a new season. It's not guaranteed that anyone's going to turn around and start the season really quickly. But I think Isak's in a position to do that because he's come back and he looks really sharp. He was really sharp at the MKM Stadium at the weekend. He was really sharp again with that. I mean, it was a typical Isak goal, wasn't it? To begin with, it was really, really a great finish. So I think he's in a position to start the season really, really fast. And as I said at the top of the show, I think he could get easily 25, 30 goals this season. We've got a world-class striker on Newcastle's hands there, ready to really hit the ground running. Got a couple of questions. Are we desperate? Yeah, that's Johnny's question. I think, yeah, as I sort of alluded to in the comment I just made, then I think we're at the point where Eddie Howe's being quite pleasant and being quite nice about it, because I think he was, I wouldn't say surprised by the suggestion of by what happened. Sorry, in Germany. I think he knew that was coming, but I think he was. I think he went a bit out of hand from his perspective in terms of how far it went. Chris was saying to me that the journalists in the room sort of hung on to that a lot longer than maybe he. I think he thought he was batting it away, but it wasn't. It's not about England. England's irrelevant. It's about his point that he was making. I think England sort of comes into the sort of as a useful tool for this. He's making a point about being ready for the team and being happy with how he's working at Newcastle, and I think that means signings. And a lot of people think that Eddie Howe is not on the same page as a lot of Newcastle fans when it comes to signings, and he wants to sign different players. He's not the one who should be in charge of recruitment. But actually, if you look at his record, the signings he's been mainly responsible for and behind with Tonali, he claims Isak as well, and Anthony Gordon were the three signings that were mainly his, and sorry Trippier as well. So they're all three major signings. So he wants players of that quality. And also, as I mentioned in my video again about Almiron last time on Monday, he's not in the mood to talk about Almiron as part of the future. He's talked very openly and very pleasantly about Almiron in the past. So I think he's being very, very calm and collected and, playing the part at the moment. But if something doesn't change in terms of a big arrival, I think we can get, and certainly by the time of the sell, if you look at the equivalent, Newcastle had already signed Pope and Botman in the first season by the end of June, and they'd already signed Tonali, and they were about to sign Livramento by the Salah Cup last year. They're nowhere near that level of recruitment. And yes, there are mitigating circumstances in Paul Mitchell coming in the Euros. In PSR, I asked Eddie Howe about PSR directly on Saturday, and he said PSR's had a massive influence. And you can see that across the league. I mean, not everyone's not doing the same amount of business as you'd imagine by this point in the summer. But Newcastle, Eddie Howe, someone who, as I've mentioned, he needs players to be ready. And Newcastle can't afford an Anthony Gordon situation in the summer where a player takes 6 months. As good as Anthony Gordon is, it took him 6 months to settle in. Newcastle can't afford that, and there's been no time for him to settle in. So I think desperate's a strong word, but I do think that there's definitely a sense that that something has to give for Newcastle and for Eddie Howe. Otherwise, there's a bit of an issue. My ideal choice for right-sided centre-half, right wing, and second striker from Michael. Yeah, so anyone who's aware of the videos that I've done on the channel in the recent weeks, my second choice, my second striker choice, is definitely Jonathan David. I did a video on him with Steve Caldwell, who worked really well with Jonathan David at the Canada national team. and he looks and sounds like the right kind of player. If you look at the value, look at what Newcastle were talking about paying for Dominic Calvert-Lewin earlier in the window. It's definitely more than what Lille will accept for Jonathan David. David is 20 to 30 million, according to Steve, and Steve is quite clued up in terms of where David's future lies. And his wages are about £30,000 a week at the moment. So there's definitely scope to build there. Whereas someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin, for example, who's another option that Newcastle have looked at as a tangible option, is 27. He's only scored double figures twice in the Premier League. He's quite experienced, obviously, but he's got injury problems. So there's not a lot there to suggest that he's actually that great of a fit. I know physicality-wise, and there's a lot that Eddie Howe likes about him. And Jonathan David isn't the same type of player as Calvert-Lewin, but he's good in other ways. So behind the second striker would be Jonathan David. The right side, the centre half. I like the idea of Malik Thiaw because I think what my actual choice a long time ago was actually Tosin Adarabioyo. I thought he would have been a really, really good centre half to sign even before he was we knew he was on a free transfer and Newcastle were actually chasing that deal. I think Thiaw is incredibly similar in terms of the way he plays. He's incredibly agile. He can allow Newcastle to push up the pitch high. He's quite deceptively quick. He's tall. Physicality is a crucial thing for that right centre half. I don't want Newcastle to sign another Botman or another Schär, and that's what I sort of said in my video on Antonio Silva, who's one of the best centre halves in Europe. But he is not the type of player that's really going to make a difference for Newcastle in the way that Newcastle needs to make a difference. They need physicality, they need pace, they need an injection of something like that, and Thiaw would be really good for that. I think he's also at the right age, 22. I think Newcastle. I don't know if Newcastle are going to make what you would call a marquee signing this summer. I think there could be 2 or 3 really exciting younger players, like a Thiaw, like a David, who's 24. You know, like Noni Madueke, possibly as well in there too. I think there's quite a few options that Newcastle are considering. For me, as I say, Thiaw would be a right-sided centre half option of choice in terms of style. I don't know if they're still looking at Todibo, who has been linked with Juventus. He was obviously at the Salah Cup last year. Right hand side of the right winger as well. I think again it's interesting to note that they're interested in Madueke. I think there's a deal to be done there. I know a lot of people don't like that idea, but I know what he was like at PSV, and he's better than his stats suggest. I think he's ready to be molded, and I think there's not the right environment, if you like, at PSV Eindhoven. That environment doesn't really exist. So at Chelsea. So I think that there's a possibility that he could come in and he'd be a good signing. And Mbeumo would be the obvious replacement, the obvious option, I think, though, because he's Premier League proven, he's ready, he's 45 million, roughly. If Brentford are willing to sell, I think that's a crucial thing. I don't think Brentford are willing to sell, given that Ivan Toney's likely to go at some point, although they are struggling to find a deal for Toney. So Mbeumo would be a good option. But for me, I think I expect them to go for 2 or 3 younger players because the value's there. They have around £100 million to spend, I think, with or without sales. There's obviously then, do you look at, improving at right back if Trippier goes? Because I know that Livramento is definitely good enough to start Livramento is definitely good enough to start at right back now, but is the option if he gets injured good enough? I'm not convinced it is. We know with the centre back option that there's been tentative interest in a couple of Premier League players, Branthwaite being one, but I think that's too far. And I know Luke Edwards tweeted saying that it might be a name that comes out. A signing is close. It might be a name that comes out of the blue. Lots of people jumped on that, said it would be Branthwaite. I think Branthwaite is, if Everton are a no dealing Manchester United straight away at 45 million, there's absolutely no hope in hell that Newcastle are able to match that. And again, you've got to be a little bit probably less ambitious with that, because Newcastle are in a position where they haven't got European football, and they're also trying to keep in this wage structure. They're trying to look a little bit, longer term in terms of their deals. So I think for me, Teao, Madueke, possibly, and Bumo. But I love the idea of Daniel Marlin. I said that in a video, but he's not right-footed and he's not a target at the moment for Newcastle, so I have to sort of put that one to a side. But there's obviously Gibbs White is another option who would give a different sort of option as well. So I think there's plenty of good options out there. It's just whether Newcastle are sort of willing to push the ball. It depends on, and it also depends on what Newcastle are looking to do in terms of recruitment. Whether Paul Mitchell coming in means that there's a slight shake-up, because people talk about Eddie Howe, and it's right, and I've mentioned this on my videos about how Eddie Howe works with Paul Mitchell, but also you've got to remember that Steve Nixon is the head of recruitment, and Andy Howe, Eddie Howe's nephew, is his assistant. They've had a good go at trying for he's had a good go at the European market with Isak and Bruno. They were his main signings, and then Newcastle's and Botman as well. They were the ones that Nixon really drove, from what I'm aware of. So does he deserve, given that track record, to be usurped? So there's things to go. There's lots of things in the chat that while I've been rambling, so I do apologize. Yeah, so Jay said Milan paid €7 million for Thiaw. They're trying to rinse us by getting 40 million. I can understand that viewpoint. I think there's lots of things about the way that Newcastle are viewed in Europe compared to how they're viewed in the UK, and specifically internally Newcastle. We know that Newcastle don't actually have that much money. Lots of things with agents and media from abroad, you'll see Newcastle's name linked with big money, and I think clubs want to test that out. We'll talk about the PSR situation, because there's obviously this Anthony Gordon rumor that I'll touch on. I do want your thoughts as well in the chat. But I think with Thiaw, he's had 2 years at Milan. Yes, he hasn't started that many games, but I think that because of everything I mentioned in terms of the profile, in terms of the age, in terms of the fact that he's played 3 times for Germany, I don't think that Newcastle will pay 40 million euros. I think it'll be a settled thing at 30, 35. I think that's why Newcastle have targeted him and not somebody more like Anthony Silva, who is going to cost, or Branthwaite, who is going to cost above that and is going to go above 35, 40. So for me, I think 30 is probably where they'll deal, or 35 million euros, just above 30 million quid. And given everything, the fact that his experience is growing and he's getting a bit better, I think that's probably about right. But 40, I can understand why, given that they paid 7 and he hasn't actually started and been a main player for them. And you look at Tomori, Fikayo Tomori as an option. Let me put this in the chat. I'd love to do a response to this. Would you rather pay 30 million pounds, so 35 euros roughly, for Thiaw, or would you rather pay 40 million for Tomori? I'd love to know, because Tomori is a dream centre-half signing for Newcastle. They've liked him for a long time. He was obviously brilliant in, I think, both. I think he played with Thiaw in the San Siro against Newcastle. He made that goal line tackle against Miggy in the home leg as well, but he was fantastic in the San Siro, Tomori. I think Newcastle would love him. Would you rather pay less for Thiaw and get that done now, or wait a little bit longer and pay a bit more for Tomori? I'd love to know what your thoughts are on that. Harry, give me your honest opinion. What do you think the chance of Newcastle don't buy any players this season? No, I don't think that's likely, because they are like the thing you've got to remember about that sort of, and I understand a little bit why this is seen as this sort of this. I understand why this is the panic is setting in, But you've got to remember that Newcastle have brought in Paul Mitchell this summer. And Paul Mitchell isn't just one of the best sporting directors and recruitment people in terms of recruitment. I've done a couple of videos on this. Go and check them out as well. But he isn't just one of the best in terms of recruitment and one of the highest rated people. He's also very, very good at setting tone of clubs right down the thing. But he's also rejected moves from Chelsea and Manchester United in the last year. He's been very difficult and actually signalled to Newcastle, or at least we were all told. I was told a few months ago, that he was an option for Newcastle. He just said no. So, and he wasn't likely to join. So the fact that he's arrived and somebody with that sort of reputation, that sort of expectation for turning clubs around, look what he did at Monaco in a couple of years, look at what he did at Spurs in a couple of years. He isn't here for a long term. He might be here for a long term project, but he isn't here to set in the way that Ashworth is, who came in with a big plan and he was the sort of centre of the wheel. Mitchell's come in to make a difference in recruitment, and that starts now. So it'll take a while, perhaps, but I think for me, this is a deal this is a man that's come in to make a couple of key signs. I think they're probably taking their time a little bit. I understand, as I've mentioned, it's frustrating me as much as it's frustrating you, as much as it's frustrating Eddie Howe. But for me, you don't bring Paul Mitchell in and then and sit him on the sidelines and not allow him to do it and not see him do any work in the first few weeks. That means that Eddie Howe's probably under a bit of pressure as well, because he's accepted that job while he's rejected Chelsea and Man United. Why has he accepted Newcastle? What is it about Newcastle that's brought him to the table? So I think that's important to remember in terms of, I understand the whole David Thompson, don't care, it's not money. Yeah, I get that as well. I understand why there's a bit of fretting about this, but okay, I just think you need to remember about about Paul Mitchell and why he's here. Why have Newcastle been able to attract him? And the fact that Stavely and Caducci have gone really suggests that this is a very ruthless time for Newcastle and a very crucial time. They still have to obey PSR rules to a point. I think that I want to explain about PSR as best I can, because them losing the first year where they basically spent and didn't bring any money in was really, really big for them, because that means now in that every year that's on the books, and Darren Neal said this in his interview, every year that's on the books, Newcastle have now earned something from player sales, revenue, or whatever. But they were burnt quite badly by PSR, basically because they bought Isak and they bought Gordon, and they sort of kicked the can down the road. They don't want to do. I think that's where they got to this situation, because they kicked the can down the road. So they don't want to do that. So that's suddenly 40 million to pay for a player who might be worth 30. I understand why fans want it done quickly, but that becomes very important, and you've got to consider that. So I think for me, there's got to be a point where you look at PSR as in terms of that. It doesn't mean that nothing's going to happen. It doesn't mean anything in terms of concerns about where the money's coming from, but going to, and where the players are when the players are coming in, should I say? But it just means that's potentially playing into a little bit. And as I say, Eddie Howe did say that he thinks that PSR has had an impact across the board, and I agree with him, because look at Arsenal only signed Calafiori now. Man United have only signed Yoro and Xerxes, who's way overpaid, by the way. I mean, the fact that Real Madrid were only willing to pay 40 and Liverpool didn't even enter the conversation with Manchester United shows you that as good as Yoro is, he's not probably ready to pay £50 million for. And Xerxes' contract release clause was there to be paid. So that's why this has happened. And that's why PSR is still manageable, even though they've got through the deadline, and obviously that was painful. They don't want to go through that again, and I don't know how surprised they were to find out how much. Because the thing that frustrates me is, actually, if you look back at that, they were kind of briefing in a way that suggested that selling Minter would have been enough, and I think everyone, correct me if I'm wrong again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everyone thought that Minter going would have been enough, and I think the club put that out there, and the fact that they were quite disingenuous with that, in my opinion. So I think that maybe they were burnt a bit more than they thought. I don't know, but I think that's why they're going to be a bit careful. Why they're not signing people straight away. And I understand David's point about it being not our money. It's not our money, absolutely. But at the same time, you don't want to be in a position in 2 years' time where they're having to sell another key player because they're a few million. They're a few million over. And I understand, again, people say just take the points deduction, but serious clubs at the very elite level where Newcastle want to get to don't take points deductions. So I think that they're looking more likely to do that. Sorry, I'm just reading a few of these comments that are coming. Way more than I thought there would be, by the way. I thought I was going to be the only one sat here talking to myself. So thank you so much for joining me. Sai says, I'd rather we sign Teao as he's got age on his side and a high ceiling than Tomori. Yeah, I would. I think that's definitely a fair assessment because you are signing someone in Teao. That's the exciting thing. I mean, again, look at the thing that's in common with the best signings. Maybe Bruno Sai's a couple of years older, but Botman, Isak, and Gordon were all 22, which is the same age that Teao is, and they're now settled in and a massive part of what Newcastle are doing, and they're only now 24, 23, 24. Obviously, Botman being injured is a massive shame, but I think the fact that Teao being 22 makes a massive difference because, and it will do in recruitment meetings, because that's what they look for in terms of that age. And that's what I was saying about players who you might not look at and think of as elite signings. There might not be a Tonali or an Isak or a Gordon who's coming in for 40, 50 million this summer, but there might be a couple, 2 or 3, 30, 35 million players. And I think I think that's a good way of strengthening the squad, because you've got to remember that this squad is generally, if everyone's fit, is very, very strong, especially with someone like Tonali coming back. And if Tonali comes in and does really well this season, then Newcastle's midfield just escalates in terms of quality. Joe Linton is there as well. Bruno, that's one of the best midfields in the country. And then you've got Gordon up front. Again, I do want to touch on the Gordon rumours. What do you think of the Gordon rumours, whether the Liverpool rumours, and what price would you sell Gordon for? I'd love to know that, because if there's any price you would sell Gordon for, is he viewed as, because I think the fact that they offered him over Bruno when Bruno had a release clause, and Isak as well, they actually opened conversations for Gordon in their hour of need, suggest that Newcastle maybe don't see Gordon on the same level as Isak and Bruno. Do you see that? Interested to know. But yeah, I think this is very, very much a case of a summer where there's 2 or 3 sort of younger, exciting players who maybe don't strike you as a Tonali, as an Isak, as a game changer, but fit around those players that exist, and as I mentioned, have come in and been there for a couple of years and been fantastic. This is something that, yeah, I think that Newcastle are going to be in a position where they can strike through a couple of good players in the summer. But as I say, I don't think they're going to be key players. Just reading through a couple of these. Yeah, I think that there's 50 million for Silva. There's a good from Andy. Yeah, again, that's just a fee that's not going to happen for Newcastle on a centre back, because again, and I said on a video ages ago when we all thought that Tosin was signing and Kelly was signing, doing those deals early and doing those and getting those players in was going to be a way, almost a cheat code for the summer, because it would have meant that they could have gone and spent big, and that's around the time that they were bidding 60 on. And remember, they did bid and get to speak to Michael Elise, so there's obviously scope for something big to happen if they want it. I think the Wilson injury, again, sort of similar to when they signed Isak, has probably changed their sort of thinking in terms of how they go about spreading that money. Did they go big on a centre half? Sorry, on a right winger. Do they then go big on a striker, or did they go big on a centre half? I think the centre half is the least of you don't. I think you don't have to go big on a centre half to get a quality centre half. Whereas I think more often than not, when it comes to right wingers and forward players, generally you kind of have to spend a bit more. I don't know what you think, but for me, I would suggest that signing somebody like Silva for 50 million. I think that you're right, Andy. I think that's why Newcastle have probably. I mean, they're huge fans of his, but so are Real Madrid, and that's the challenge Newcastle face. They're trying to buy these players, trying to get these players in without breaking the bank and trying to compete with teams like Real Madrid that they can't compete with. And I think that's why Silva's a bit out of the presence. And I think that's why Te'o is the man that they want, because the other ones, I've mentioned Tomori, I've mentioned Branthwaite, I've mentioned Silva, they're all way more expensive than even the suggestion of 40 million for Te'o. And I wouldn't worry about, by the way, the other thing to say about Te'o is I wouldn't worry about the longevity that this is taking. And I understand that the timing at the point of the summer that this is taking, the timing is different. It's later and the season's only a couple of weeks away and Salah Cup's around the corner and all that. But they've waited a long time for Botman. They waited 6 months for Botman. There was that tug of war with Milan, which actually ironically led them to sign Te'o. There's been a long wait for, there was a long wait for Gordon again. So Newcastle have gone deep into these negotiations to try and get the best deal. In the end, with Gordon and Isak, they kind of went, as I said, we'll just have to do it because and risk it. And I think that they're kind of loath to do that because of where that eventually ended up for them. But I think we're in a position where that no one's panicking yet, but I can understand why fans are because of the position in the window it is in. How close are we to selling Miggy? Is the question. If he stays, we don't get. Sorry, I can't read that bit. A new right. If he stays, we don't get a new right winger. He's. He's the domino we're willing to fall. I think, yeah, I get that. I think, first of all, to answer the question, I think Newcastle will sell Magarma on this summer. That's my gut feeling, and I think, as I said on Monday's show, on the Monday show, the way that the fans reacted to the Miggy comments from Howe on Saturday was odd to me, because and again, I know you're not privy to the question being asked, you're only privy to the quotes. The question he was asked directly was, do you want to keep Miggy? Basically, I can't remember the exact wording, but he was asked, do you want to keep Miggy? And he said, we're welcoming him back. He's been great for Newcastle over the years. He was great before I arrived. He's got a lovely personality and a big smile on his face, and I'm looking forward to that again. Of course, he's looking forward to working with Miggy again, because Miggy's a top lad. We know this. But he didn't, crucially, he turned around the question, he skirted around the question, didn't answer it, and also then didn't suggest that nothing was in the pipeline. It's like the England job. It's like anything that's happening. If nothing's immediate, there's no point in commenting on it. And we know that Eddie Howe is most like that. I mean, remember the Harvey Barnes situation when he was sat in wherever they were in America, probably in the next room to the media conference, ready to be announced, and Eddie Howe's telling the press that he's not set to join. So this is a situation for me with Miggy that, again, I can understand the lack of noise is frustrating people, but there's no rush to sell Miggy anymore. It's not the PSR deadline, so I think they'll find a deal that suits. There are a couple of Spanish clubs that have been linked with him. I've spoken to a couple of people around Miggy. Couple of Spanish clubs are interested, and so it isn't just Saudi, despite what people think. He doesn't want to go to Saudi. That's the thing, and he didn't want to go in January. We know that, and it's interesting to know whether Newcastle are going to push him to go to Saudi if it comes to that. I think he'll go eventually, because I think there's less of a I think there's an idea that Eddie Howe wanted to keep the squad together, but when it was January, it wasn't worth upsetting the apple cart back then. Whereas now, it's sort of kind of, I think it's pretty obvious to everybody that Miggy's kind of come to the end at Newcastle, and I think he will eventually do that. So just again reading some of these comments. Again, thank you so much. Way more than I thought there was going to be. I think we'll keep it going for another sort of 10, 15 minutes if we can. It's been a very, very successful opening live stream, so thanks so much for that. So somebody, I think MF has just said that I think he's talking about Gordon, practically untouchable, so you'll struggle to replace the output. They put you a season behind. Yeah, so this is an interesting point, because I wrote an article for the BBC Sport website in January, actually, explaining the whole. Remember when they were talking about selling Almiron, Trippier, and Wilson? And I remember saying that if you said the difference, the issue is there's about a 200 million difference between Newcastle in terms of revenue, or there was at the time, between Newcastle and Tottenham in terms of revenue. And it's a different point to suggest that Newcastle are actually above Spurs in that specific race back in 2007 when Mike Ashley bought the club. And that kind of perfectly represents what Ashley's done in terms of damaging the club. Newcastle are in a position where they want to. They were looking at selling those players, and I said that Isak and Gordon and Bruno are three players that you can sell to easily close that £200 million gap, but you would open it up on the pitch, and it would put you a season behind. I think it is really, really crucial that Newcastle do whatever they can. This is kind of the message they had with Isak. I think they kind of accepted Bruno might have to go, because that's why they bought Tonali. That's why they put the release clause in his contract and guaranteed 100 million if they were going to sell him. I think they might get another year out of him, but eventually I think he's going to go at some point if Newcastle, especially if they don't get in the Champions League. But those three players, if you sell them, you run the risk of, as has been mentioned in that comment, of going the season behind. So I think it's really important for Newcastle to try and keep Gordon. The thing is that they've opened that kind of worms now by possibly doing a deal for Gordon. I think if you open that kind of worm, especially with his being his club, his favorite team, Liverpool, he's going to look at that and think, maybe. And I think that's what's happened by the sounds of it. So this talk of a deal being, by the way, the article in the Liverpool Echo that suggested that it could happen now. It's an opinion piece. It's an opinion piece that suggests that Newcastle, that Liverpool are getting their ducks in a row now, because they've had issues with the same thing that Newcastle have with the new sporting director. Richard Hughes is coming in July. That's pushed things back. Arne Slot's replaced Klopp. It's taken a lot of time for everyone to bed in, and they're going to get going now in August. And their first port call is going to be Gordon. There's nothing to actually suggest that Newcastle are going to agree to it. There's nothing to suggest that Gordon's even going to push for it. It's just an idea. That's basically what I read from that article. That's what I took from it. So I don't necessarily think Gordon's going to go anywhere, but it's just, I think Newcastle have, by opening that kind of worms, they've run the risk of this. And ultimately, I don't think Gordon's going to push for the move. I think he loves Newcastle. I think he loves working with Eddie Howe. I think he's aware of what he's got. And it's similar to Bruno with Newcastle as well. He's not going to push to break that potential issue, to break that potential relationship. I think but if something comes onto the table, then they might go for it then. But I think, Gordon is a really interesting case. And yes, but I agree with that comment that he, if you let him go, you do run the risk of going a season behind. Mickey Townsend, how come I'm not in Japan? Freelance, that's why. So I'd have to pay to go by myself. I'd have to have paid a ticket to go out there. I was asked if I was out there to do some work for a couple of people, but I don't have the sort of money to easily go to Japan and pay the money to go to Japan. And there's a couple of things that I'll do an update video in a couple of weeks where I explain what's happening. And there's one thing that means that I didn't. The reason why I don't have the money to go to Japan and the time to go to Japan is coming up. I'll put more of that in a video in a couple of weeks with a situation. Dave says, I honestly don't think Madueke or Teo will come. I wonder why that is. West Ham signed. He's also then come back and said West Ham signing Somerville now. Really haven't got a clue what's going on with this window. I can understand the threat and the worry, but if you look at what's really happened, Liverpool are in the same position I just mentioned as Newcastle when it comes to transfers. You've got Manchester United, the only club who've done much. West Ham have done. They're rumored to be doing quite a lot, but they haven't actually done that much yet. They've obviously signed. We're obviously on the verge of signing Somerville. Somerville's a left winger. He's another one that's been linked with Newcastle. Newcastle have liked him, looked at him, but he's a left winger ultimately. And I think the difference between this summer and last summer is that I don't think you'll see much of those opportunistic signings where if a player comes up that's a good player and the right price that might go for it. I think they are specifically looking for right wingers and right centre half. So I understand the threat, the worry, but I just think that I can understand, as I say, but I think give it a couple of weeks and we'll see. Well, I think the telling thing will be is if Newcastle are in a position to sign one in a couple of weeks. If not, if Eddie Howe has to talk, if Eddie Howe has to come out and say something again, then we might be in a position to worry then. But I think I don't worry about the Thiago situation. I think the agent coming out and saying that there's a 10 million surplus. I think Milan have just signed a centre half in Pavlovic from Salzburg, and Newcastle are negotiating harder than maybe Newcastle fans would like for Thiago. And I think it's an agent tactic to say that he'd be happy to stay at Milan, because it means that if he comes out and says he's desperate to join Newcastle, then Newcastle are they recognise that they can get him for cheaper. So it's all posture. As I said in the video, I think there's lots of things that are coming out of this I think that Newcastle will probably get a couple of players. We need to offer Gordon a new contract. If he doesn't want to sign it, we need to sell. He's only got 2 years left. Yeah, again, that's a really good point. I think actually lots of people aren't mentioning this, is that Gordon's contract actually runs out in a couple of years. So Newcastle's strong position as it stands won't last that much if they don't do something. So there is a sort of, this might be and I think this may be why Liverpool are quite confident in getting him, because there's a sort of crossroads with these players. There's there's a myth that contracts don't mean anything, but actually they do until crucial points when they're about to run down. 2 years because that's the last year when maximum value can be found. 1 year because they're a year away and it's the last bit of value they can find. Or obviously when it's run out, then the player has complete control. So that's a really good point from Sai saying that we need to offer Gordon a new contract, because if they don't offer him a new contract, this is the year when they can get 7,500, whatever it is. But if you bought him for 45, what's the point in selling him for when he's improved so much? What's the point in selling him for 75? Is the value in holding back and getting another good year? I think if I'm honest, I think a lot of those lads, Bruno and Gordon, will probably look at this season and say, because this is the season where pressure really changes on Newcastle. Now, this is the season when, if you look at the first year, it was all about survival after the takeover. The first season, they completely blew all expectation out the wall by getting in the Champions League ahead of schedule. That then played into last season when they probably weren't ready. Their squad wasn't ready. They didn't really deal with the whole situation. And obviously, the injury crisis was a byproduct of that. Now there's no European football, and as I say, Paul Mitchell's in, Stavey's gone. There's a reshuffle at the top. The pressure is on for Eddie Howe, but also I think the pressure is on from Bruno, from Gordon, from Isak to say, look, now we know where the club's trying to go. If it goes that far and we see a future with them, we'll go with it. But if there's bigger offers out there and Newcastle aren't achieving on the pitch, unfortunately, that means Newcastle aren't likely to be able to keep these players. And Gordon, as Si points out, is a really, really good example of where the problems lie with that, because obviously he's got a couple of years on his contract. Is someone like Scalvini unattainable? I don't think so. And Serie A is a very interesting market this summer. It's one that Newcastle, and obviously with Tonali last year, they're obviously quite interested in looking at, because they obviously looked at Barella. I know Barella's name has become a bit of a joke because of what happened, but Newcastle were interested that he was on the list, and also Teo Hernandez as well. There's one that was interesting, and that didn't quite come off, but they're looking at Serie A players. Scalvini, again, I think because Atalanta got into the Champions League through the Europa League last season, I think they're in a strong position not to negotiate beyond what Newcastle are willing to pay for a centre-half. And as I mentioned earlier, if they've got, say, 100, let's say, I don't know for certain, by the way, but if they've got, say, 100 million, if they've got sort of 100 million to spend on three players, the lowest of those players in terms of value will be the centre half, plainly because your money goes further with centre halves. If you're going to pay 35 million for a Teo, who's one of the really exciting players on the list, you can pay. I think Newcastle can get him for 30 million. You'd get laughed out of town if you offer 30 for Scalvini or Silva or Branthwaite or any of those mentioned. So Scalvini, yeah, it's possible, but again, I think the value of the situation is where we are now with that. 70 plus, then yes for Gordon, says Jay. So does that mean then, again, going back to that question, that you don't see him in the same way that, like Newcastle, in the same way that Newcastle see Bruno and Isak, who are completely irreplaceable? I mean, to the point where, and I think this is down to options. So up front, there aren't that many options, are there? Like, we can be honest about this. Like, Jonathan David's a good option because of the value he's got, but he's not if he's not going to come in and replace Isak. So if Newcastle were to sell Isak hypothetically, where could they go for a player who's remotely close to how good he is, and certainly how good he is at what he does? Because he's really unique in the way he plays. He's not many players there are reasons why he's the only player that he gets compared to is Thierry Henry, and he was particularly unique in those same ways. So if they sell Isak, then there's no way of them getting any money, anywhere close to replacing him. Same with Bruno. Is it the same with Gordon? And David Thompson's just pointed out, we have Barnes. Barnes is a bit of an unknown quantity in the sense that Tonali is, that we don't know how well he's going to do this season. I think it's really interesting. That's a good point. And it sounds like, again, from you guys, that you're sort of more open to selling Gordon than you would be Bruno or Isak. Again, come into the chat now and tell me I'm wrong. But it certainly looks like that bump from what I'm reading, and that's the way the club views it. I think there's a point where, because the point about the contract is absolutely really, really, really fair. Newcastle, where they lose grip of that. So tie into a new contract now, up his wages. Again, they're in a sort of catch-22 because they really, really don't want to break the wage structure either. So do they go and risk, give Gordon Bruno wages when you're already talking to Isak about a contract, which will probably you're already talking to Isak about a contract which will probably out. He'll probably be on more than Bruno is. So yeah, do you look at selling doing that and giving, is Gordon worth that, or do you consider selling him this summer for a decent profit of 80 to 100 million? Well, which obviously the profit there would be about 40 to 50. I think it's more complicated with Gordon. I think that's the reason why these rumours, partly because Newcastle opened that door, but also because that contract situation. I don't know why they didn't tie him down to a longer contract, but I wasn't in the room at the time, so I don't know. Got a couple. Bruno is one of, if not the best midfielders we've ever had. I don't think Gordon is that bracket yet. That's from Jay, and I completely agree. That's I think I've said this on the True Faith pods that I've done. We've done a couple of them on the True Faith called Class Lads, one on Bruno and one on Isak. And in both cases, I've said that those two players are world class and on a level that Newcastle haven't had that many players in the past. I mean, Shearer, how many other world class players have Newcastle, like legitimately unarguable world class players of Newcastle, had in our lives? Not many. So Gordon, as good as he's been, but I think the other crucial thing to mention about Gordon is that Isak and Bruno came as those players. They came and they've improved. They've got better, arguably, but they came as players known across Europe with that potential. Gordon was a player that not many people at Newcastle were convinced by in terms of the fan base. Lots of people were unsure about him, but and his temperament and the value that was put on his head. And Chelsea looked at bidding and chose against it. And then he's become the player that he has because of working with Eddie Howe. I think that's the difference between Gordon and Bruno and Isak. So I completely agree with that point there from Jay, I think it was. So a couple more things to get through. It's easier to replace a world-class midfielder than a world-class forward. That's from Sai again. There are more top midfielders in the market than forwards. Isak is irreplaceable. I agree with that. Again, I think that's a really, really good point. And something that, for me, I think that's. I think in terms of the style, but also you got to think that how many players. Do you think that Bruno is as good? There are players out there that Newcastle could get that could do what Bruno does. I agree with the principle. There are better world class players than there are world class forwards, and actually, there are better. There are more. There's probably about. I could probably list you about 10 world class midfielders off the top of my head. I don't think I could list you more than 3 maybe. Elite forwards, like number 9s traditionally, like not counting Mbappe or anyone like that. So I agree with that, but I think. I think that's a really, really fair point. The stadium name needs to go, and not the players. Change to Aramco SJP and get billions. That's from Des. I think. Sorry, my eyesight's really bad. I think that's a really interesting point, and more so than maybe the stadium name. I think you could argue possibly the training ground. They haven't got a sponsor for the training ground yet. That's been something that I think has frustrated quite a few people. I think but there's obviously a value difference in terms of what you can get for a stadium name, what you can get for a player. But I don't honestly think it's that deep in terms of what Newcastle is. Obviously, because of the mitigating circumstances that I've just said about Gordon's contract. But if you had the choice, and again, this is something I've said before, if you had the choice between selling a Bruno, selling a Gordon, selling an Isak, and then really going big on your replacements, so getting better replacements, getting the centre back you dream of, getting the right winger you dream of, but you also then have to go and get the centre mid or the other left winger that you dream of as well, arguably. Would you rather that, or would you rather keep those 3 players and strengthen around them with decent players on the budget that Newcastle have, which is a sort of ballpark figure, let's say about 100 million. So you're looking at 35 million quid per per option, but you don't need to pay that for. But you can use obviously David. You can get for 25, so that's 10 million. So let's say 25 for David, 45 for the right winger, and 35 for the centre back Teao as 3 options. Or would you rather go and get somebody like, sell a Bruno, sell a Gordon, and go and get somebody better? I think for me, I'd rather keep those players, keep the spine of the team in place, and then because you can get players who might not be a Tonali, it might not be as I say, a world class player, but you could go and get a good player who's an upgrade in those positions, who Eddie Howe could work with going forward, and I think that for me would be a better way of doing things. If you sell one of them, the worry is that would be a down season and losing another. Yeah, I see. That's the thing. As I say, like these situations, it's not Football Manager or FIFA, so you can't just do that with that. I think that's a really, really good point. So you can't, if you sell Gordon, and then what does that say? What does that say to Bruno or to Isak? Or you sell Bruno, certainly. What does that say to everybody? Because Bruno is the beating heart of this team in so many ways, on the pitch, but also probably off it. And I think if you do, I think there's a worry that there's a domino effect there if you sell one. Then if you sell, one, then you have to sell another one. Emmanuel Nagma was, I can't remember his name, but Jace has mentioned his name in the chat. He was mentioned in a comment on one of my videos. Young lad, Dutch lad, I think, talented player, absolutely a brilliant player. But again, it's this whole thing. Would that be enough to appease people? Would that be enough to strengthen? It comes down to this sort of going for potential versus going for proven. And I think in this summer, and I don't even think this is a thing of Europe or not Europe. I think this is Champions League or not Champions League. If Newcastle got the Europa League, I think they'd still be in this position. If Newcastle got in the Conference League, they'd still be in this position. If they got in the Champions League, then you're looking. That's why they were able to go and attract someone like Tonali, and that's why I know people might not think of him on the same level, but that's why Villa have been able to go and get Amadou Onana when he's been linked with a lot of like Arsenal and that, because he's really, really is on that level. He's a Champions League player in my opinion. So that's why Newcastle and Villa have been able to go a little bit above their station. Whereas if Villa find themselves in Newcastle's position, which they might very well do next season, they'd be back battling these same issues because they've got PSR problems as well. Their Grealish money's run out. Obviously this summer, that's why they were in the same panicky position, having to sell Douglas Luiz for that really weird swap deal that they did with Juve. So, and is Douglas Luiz, I got in trouble on Twitter for saying that I thought that it was an upgrade. Let me know in the comments if you think the Douglas Luiz or Amadou Onana is better. But it's the sort of thing of where that's what Newcastle will have to. That's where Newcastle were last season. They were able to. Newcastle have been really, really smart actually in the fact that they've actually up until this point been able to really, really improve the team from the very start, without really having to make any drastic sales in the way that they've looked at with Gordon this season and Villa have done with Douglas Luiz, and yet they've managed to get to the Champions League. And even now, there's a feasible possibility that they go into the season with 3 new players who are all better than what they've got, and keeping Bruno, Isak, and Gordon together with Botman and Tonali. There's a spine of a ridiculously good team. I think it's more important to build around that spine rather than risk selling one of those players to go and try and get a better player. I think the comments seem to be drying up and the chat is still doing quite well, 26 people. So is there anything else you want me to touch on before we wrap this up? Coming up to an hour. I've really enjoyed it. And also please do put a note in the chat in the next couple of minutes if you want me to do another one or make this a regular thing, 5 o'clock on a Wednesday or whatever day works for you. 5 o'clock is a good time. I'm happy to do more. I was more interested just to see if this would work. And I'm actually really pleased that I've had about 30, 35 people in the chat to talk to who've been really, really good. So yeah, drop me a message now before we wrap up if you would want more of these. But I think, yeah, Newcastle got another game on Saturday in Japan. Then they come back for the Seller Cup. More chats, please. It's been a good stream. Thank you. Yes. Oh, thank you very much, guys. That's really good of you to hear. Then they come back for the Seller Cup. Got Stade Brestois and Girona, who lots of people have gone, why are we playing them? Both of those teams are Champions League teams. They both qualified for the Champions League last season. So that's, a little bit, that is actually quite a fairly good test for where Newcastle are, because they're not in Europe now. And then Southampton at home. I think this is a fairly decent position for Newcastle to be in terms of the shape of their squad as it is. Bruno coming back in, Gordon, Trippier coming back the week before for the Seller Cup, but they do need signings, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for everyone joining. I really appreciate it. And I'll look at coming back next Wednesday at 5 o'clock. And hopefully I'll be a little bit more coherent, a little bit better at it. It's my first go. So thanks so much for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you for tomorrow's Thursday show. I'll look at more in depth at these rumours that we've sort of incoherently talked about today, like Gordon, like Somerville going to West Ham's a really interesting one, because that is a player that Newcastle have looked at before, and Thiaw consistently, whether he'll join or not. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.